Donald Trump just called for something that has never happened in American history, and the Constitution says is impossible. Yet Democrats are panicking, and Republicans are silent. Here's what nobody is telling you. On February 2nd, 2026, President Trump appeared on Dan Bongino's podcast and said the words that triggered a constitutional firestorm. Quote, "The Republicans should say, 'We want to take over. We should take over the voting in at least many 15 places. The Republicans ought to nationalize the voting.'" End quote. And before you dismiss this as typical Trump exaggeration or media hysteria, you need to understand what happened in the next 48 hours. Because this isn't about policy disagreements or partisan spin. This is about a sitting president openly stating he wants federal control over state elections, and then doubling down when challenged. And if you understand why the Constitution makes this impossible, you'll see why legal scholars on both sides are calling this the most dangerous moment for American federalism in over a century. First, what did Trump actually say? Because context matters, and we need the exact words. Trump was on Dan Bongino's show talking about election fraud, his usual claims about non-citizens voting illegally, immigrant voting schemes, all the standard talking points. And then he pivoted to this, quote, "It's amazing that the Republicans aren't tougher on it. The Republicans should say, 'We want to take over. We should take over the voting in at least many 15 places. The Republicans ought to nationalize the voting.'" End quote. Bongino didn't ask for clarification, Trump didn't elaborate, and the interview moved on. But within hours, the clip went viral. Democrats started filing emergency motions, and constitutional law professors started writing op-eds explaining why what Trump suggested is literally unconstitutional. The next day, February 3rd, Trump signed a bill ending the government shutdown in the Oval Office, surrounded by Republican lawmakers, and reporters asked him to clarify the "nationalize elections" comment. His response? Quote, "If a state can't run an election, I think the people behind me should do something about it. Because if you think about it, the state is an agent for the federal government in elections. I don't know why the federal government doesn't do them anyway." End quote. Then a reporter reminded him the Constitution says states administer elections. Trump's response, quote, "They can administer the election, but they have to do it honestly." End quote. And that's when alarm bells started ringing in every state capital in America. Because here's the constitutional problem. Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution, known as the Elections Clause, says the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. This is one of the most basic federalism principles in American government. States run elections. Congress can regulate them to some degree through federal law, but the president has zero role. None. The executive branch enforces laws Congress passes, but the president doesn't get to decide how elections are administered. That power belongs to states. And the Supreme Court has consistently interpreted this clause to mean states have near total control over voter registration, ballot counting, poll locations, early voting rules, and basically everything else related to election mechanics. Trump's claim that states are just agents for the federal government in elections is constitutionally false. States aren't agents of the federal government. They are sovereign entities with independent constitutional authority. Federalism means power is divided between national and state governments. Neither is subordinate to the other in their respective domains. And elections are explicitly a state domain. This isn't a gray area or a legal technicality. This is Civics 101, and every constitutional scholar who has weighed in, including conservative legal experts, has said Trump's interpretation has no basis in constitutional text, history, or precedent. So why is Trump saying this if it's obviously unconstitutional and obviously impossible? What's the strategy? And this is where you need to understand the context, because Trump isn't just making abstract statements about election theory. He's building a narrative for the 2026 midterms. And the narrative goes like this. The 2020 election was stolen. The 2024 election had irregularities. Democrats cheat by letting non-citizens vote. Republican states are honest. Democratic states are corrupt. And if Republicans lose seats in November 2026, it's because Democrats rigged the system again. Therefore, Republicans need to take control before the rigging happens. This narrative requires an enemy, and the enemy is state election officials in swing states, particularly Democratic secretaries of state in places like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, and Georgia. All states Trump lost in 2020, all states where he's claimed fraud without evidence, and all states that will be critical in the 2026 midterms. Trump saying Republicans should nationalize voting in 15 places isn't a policy proposal, it's a threat. It's telling those state officials, we don't trust you, we want you replaced. And if we can't replace you legally, we'll delegitimize you publicly. And here's where the Georgia raid becomes relevant. On January 30th, 2026, the FBI executed a search warrant at the Fulton County Elections Office in Georgia and seized hundreds of boxes of original 2020 ballots and voting records. The warrant was connected to an ongoing investigation into alleged election fraud in Georgia during the 2020 election. And here's the alarming part. Tulsi Gabbard, Trump's Director of National Intelligence, was physically present during the raid, and Trump personally called the FBI agents conducting the search while they were on site. This was confirmed by Gabbard herself in a letter to Congress. So the President of the United States was directly involved in a federal law enforcement operation targeting a county election office in a swing state he lost. And this happened days before he started talking about nationalizing elections. Democrats are calling this a constitutional crisis. They're arguing Trump is using federal law enforcement to intimidate state election officials and set the stage for federal intervention in the 2026 midterms. Republicans are saying this is legitimate fraud investigation. The Justice Department has legal authority to investigate election crimes. And if Georgia officials broke the law, they should be prosecuted. But even some Republican senators are uncomfortable with the optics. Senator Rand Paul said on the record, quote, "That's not what the Constitution says," end quote, when asked about nationalizing elections. And Senate Majority Leader John Thune tried to downplay Trump's comments by claiming he was only talking about the SAVE Act, which is Republican legislation requiring proof of citizenship to register to vote. But the SAVE Act has nothing to do with nationalizing elections. The SAVE Act is a congressional bill that would change voter registration requirements. It doesn't give the president power to take over state election administration. Thune's spin doesn't match Trump's actual words. Trump said take over the voting, not pass voter ID legislation. And the White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, also tried to walk it back by saying Trump supports the Constitution and states' authority to run elections. But then she added, quote, "The president believes there has obviously been a lot of fraud and irregularities that have taken place in American elections," end quote. Which contradicts the entire walkback, because if Trump believes states are conducting fraudulent elections, then of course he wants federal intervention to stop it. 3 scenarios for what happens next. And this is critical because we're 8 months from the midterms, and the groundwork for post-election chaos is being laid right now. Scenario 1. Courts shut it down. Any attempt by Trump to use federal power to interfere with state election administration will be immediately challenged in federal court. We already have precedent. In March 2025, Trump issued an executive order requiring proof of citizenship for federal voter registration. Federal Judge Colleen Collar-Cottley blocked it, ruling that the Constitution gives states and Congress power over elections, not the president. Her opinion specifically warned that the framers feared an unscrupulous executive trying to seize power through seizing the mechanics of an election. So if Trump issues another executive order attempting to federalize election administration, it'll be blocked within days. This is the most likely outcome based on existing case law. The courts have been consistent on this issue. Presidents don't control elections. Scenario 2. Congressional Republicans pass legislation. If Republicans maintain control of the House and Senate after the 2026 midterms, they could theoretically pass federal election legislation that centralizes more power in Washington. The SAVE Act is one version, but they could go further, require federal observers in certain states, mandate specific ballot counting procedures, create federal oversight committees with veto power over state certification. This would still face constitutional challenges because the Elections Clause limits how much Congress can override state authority. But unlike executive orders, which are clearly illegal, congressional action has more legal basis. The problem is, Democrats control the Senate filibuster rules. Any major election legislation needs 60 votes. Republicans don't have that. So unless they eliminate the filibuster, which Thune has said he won't do for election bills, this path is blocked too. Scenario 3. Chaos in the midterms. Trump can't legally take over elections, but he can create enough confusion and distrust that the results are contested regardless of outcome. If Republicans lose House or Senate seats in swing states, Trump will claim fraud, point to the Georgia raid as evidence the system is corrupt, and demand federal intervention after the fact. Republican state legislatures in contested states might refuse to certify results, creating dueling slates of electors or representatives. And unlike the 2020 presidential election, where the presidency was at stake and institutions held, midterm certification happens at the state level, with far less national scrutiny and weaker institutional guardrails. Trump's nationalize elections rhetoric isn't about winning a legal battle. It's about manufacturing a legitimacy crisis that justifies extra-legal action when Republicans lose races they think they should have won. And here's the hidden danger. Trump's statements are radicalizing both sides. Democrats are genuinely afraid he'll cancel elections, use ICE agents as poll intimidators, or refuse to accept any result where Democrats win. And while those fears are probably overblown because the institutional constraints are still strong, the fear itself is destabilizing. On the Republican side, hardcore MAGA activists are being primed to view any Democratic victory as illegitimate fraud, which means they'll support aggressive challenges, protests, or worse, if their candidates lose. Trump's rhetoric creates a permission structure for political violence and institutional defiance, not because he can actually nationalize elections, but because his supporters believe state officials are criminal conspirators who deserve to be overruled by any means necessary. Constitutional scholars are calling this the most direct attack on federalism since the Civil War. During Reconstruction, The federal government did temporarily take over election administration in former Confederate states, but that was under the Reconstruction Amendments, which explicitly gave Congress power to enforce civil rights in states that had rebelled. Trump has no such constitutional authority. There's no emergency, no insurrection, no legal basis whatsoever for federal takeover of elections in Georgia, Pennsylvania, or anywhere else. And yet, here's a sitting president saying it should happen anyway. Which raises the question, what do you do when a president openly advocates for unconstitutional action? Impeachment is off the table. Republicans control Congress. Court orders only work if the executive branch obeys them. And we already saw on January 6, 2021, what happens when institutional norms collapse under pressure. The next 90 days are critical. Watch what happens with the Georgia investigation. If the DOJ indicts Georgia election officials, that's a signal Trump is escalating. Watch whether Trump issues any new executive orders on elections. If he does, they'll be blocked, but the attempt itself shows intent. And watch the rhetoric. If Trump keeps saying states can't be trusted to run elections and Republicans need to take over, that's narrative prep for contesting the midterms. The question isn't whether Trump can legally nationalize elections. He can't. The question is whether he can create enough chaos and distrust that election results lose legitimacy, regardless of what courts or constitutions say. And based on the last 6 years of American politics, the answer is probably yes. Drop a comment. Do you think this is a real threat to democracy or overblown media hysteria? Hit subscribe, because in 90 days, we'll know whether the 2026 midterms were free and fair or the beginning of America's first contested midterm crisis. This story is far from over.